The flak barrage above the Ruhr should have torn number 463 Squadron apart. Most Lancasters didn't fly through that firestorm. They survived it by probability, not aerodynamics. But on the night of March 12, 1943, one particular Lancaster, call sign G. George, refused to die. She was hit 3 times on the starboard side before crossing the target. A 4th shell burst under the wing root, shearing through ribs and tearing holes big enough for moonlight to shine through. Her right inner engine sputtered, hiccuped, then caught fire. By all logic, by every manual bomber command had ever printed, she should have gone down in seconds. But she didn't. The crew braced for the roll, the fatal wing dip that would flip her into a spiral and slam her into the burning city below. The pilot's hands locked white around the column. "Hold! Hold!" She's trimming. That was the first miracle. She stayed level, bleeding speed, bleeding fuel, and flying with only 312 engines. One coughing, one dying. She still refused to surrender her lift. The crew didn't understand it yet, but they were about to learn the single reason a Lancaster could be hit again and again, and still claw her way across a continent. She wasn't designed like a bomber. She was designed like a survivor. The Germans nicknamed the Lancaster, der brennende Sarg, the burning coffin, because she so often returned home scorched, skeletal, full of holes the size of a man, yet still airborne. This night would become the textbook example. Why flak screamed around them again. The second banking turn nearly ripped the half-dead wing from its spars, but she held. The mid-upper gunner looked down through a hole torn in the fuselage and saw civilian rooftops dropping below them as if the aircraft itself were unwilling to let gravity win. The navigator whispered the truth. None dared say aloud yet. She's still flying because she knows home is behind us. What they didn't know was that this flight would become one of the most dissected engineering stories of the war. A night when design philosophy outperformed mathematics, and a bomber that should have been scrap metal refused to be anything other than alive. They weren't flying a machine anymore. They were flying a promise. And as they pointed west, across hundreds of miles of darkness, fighters, flak belts, and dead engines, they had no way of knowing. This was only the beginning of the fight to get home. The right wing of G. George looked like a butchered animal, burned canvas, torn aluminum, shredded ribs showing through like bone. Fuel was leaking in a slow mist that sparkled briefly whenever tracer fire streaked too close. Any other bomber, especially an American B-17 or B-24 hit in the same place, would already be rolling into a death spiral. But the Lancaster didn't. Why? Because unlike most heavy bombers of the war, the Lancaster carried its fuel in the fuselage, not in the wings. That design choice, criticized early in development, was now the only reason she was still alive. A hole in the wing meant drag. A hole in the fuselage meant fire. A Lancaster could bleed air. She could not bleed her own heart. That difference, a decision made by engineers in 1939, was now carrying 7 men across enemy territory. In 1943, the flight engineer shouted through the intercom, "Fuel transfer steady. Tanks still sealed. Fires out on number 3. A cheer would have been premature. 3 engines cannot carry a bomber far. 3 engines can, briefly, carry her west. But there was another reason she held steady. One bomber command rarely advertised. The Lancaster's wing wasn't just a surface, it was a suspension bridge, massively oversprung, overbuilt on purpose. A structure that didn't perform like a perfect airfoil, it endured like a cathedral roof. The Germans misjudged the RAF's design gamble. The Lancaster had no self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings because there were no fuel tanks in the wings to seal. That made her lighter, Lighter meant more lift. More lift meant more margin before death. The crew slowly absorbed what the pilot already understood. She hadn't survived the flak barrage by luck. She had survived because she had been built to take punishment first and aerodynamics second. The pilot trimmed her left side, heavy to compensate for the shredded wing. The aircraft groaned, but leveled. Over the intercom came the bomb aimer's low voice. "Charlie, she's not flying well, but she's still flying true." Behind them, the target city still glowed, orange, a furnace in the darkness. And ahead of them waited hundreds of miles of night sky patrolled by German night fighters hunting cripples, exactly like them. The gunner adjusted his turret and whispered, "Now the real trouble starts." They had survived flak. Now they had to survive the hunters. This wasn't a return journey. It was a gauntlet. The right wing of G. George looked like a butchered animal. Burned canvas, torn aluminum, shredded ribs showing through like bone. Fuel was leaking in a slow mist that sparkled briefly whenever. Tracer fire streaked too close. Any other bomber, especially an American B-17 or B-24 hit in the same place, would already be rolling into a death spiral. But the Lancaster didn't. Why? Because unlike most heavy bombers of the war, the Lancaster carried its fuel in the fuselage, not in the wings. That design choice, criticized early in development, was now the only reason she was still alive. A hole in the wing meant drag. A hole in the fuselage meant fire. A Lancaster could bleed air. She could not bleed her own heart. That difference, a decision made by engineers in 1939, was now carrying 7 men across enemy territory in 1943. The flight engineer shouted through the intercom, "Fuel transfer steady, tanks still sealed. Fires out on number 3. A cheer would have been premature. 3 engines cannot carry a bomber far. 3 engines can, briefly, carry her west. But there was another reason she held steady. One bomber command rarely advertised. The Lancaster's wing wasn't just a surface, it was a suspension bridge, massively oversprung, overbuilt on purpose, a structure that didn't perform like a perfect airfoil. It endured like a cathedral roof. The Germans misjudged the RAF's design gamble. The Lancaster had no self-sealing fuel tanks in the wings because there were no fuel tanks in the wings to seal. That made her lighter. Lighter meant more lift. More lift meant more margin before death. The crew slowly absorbed what the pilot already understood. She hadn't survived the flak barrage by luck. She had survived because she had been built to take punishment first and aerodynamics second. The pilot trimmed her left side, heavy to compensate for the shredded wing. The aircraft groaned, but leveled. Over the intercom came the bomb aimer's low voice. "She's not flying well, but she's still flying true." Behind them, the target city still glowed, orange, a furnace in the darkness. And ahead of them waited hundreds of miles of night sky patrolled by German night fighters hunting cripples, exactly like them. The gunner adjusted his turret and whispered, "Now the real trouble starts." They had survived flak. Now they had to survive the hunters. This wasn't a return journey, it was a gauntlet. The German night fighter continued to climb. Beneath them, patient, silent, a shadow with teeth. He did not fire, not yet. He was waiting for the perfect upward solution, the moment when the Lancaster's belly would fill his gun sight in a single clean silhouette. The rear gunner whispered again, "He's almost under us, 20 degrees below horizon." They couldn't dive. They couldn't jink. A crippled bomber had no violent moves left. So the pilot did something else. Something a German hunter would never expect from a 4-engine heavy. He nearly stalled the aircraft on purpose. He bled airspeed until it dropped right into the edge of aerodynamic rebellion. The bomber sank. Not abruptly, but impossibly slow, like a wounded animal, refusing to fall. The Luftwaffe pilot beneath them anticipated. A standard glide correction, a textbook, compensatory dip that every bomber performed when hit. But the Lancaster didn't fly like a typical bomber. Her giant wing surface area, built for high-altitude lift and bomb-load endurance, gave her an unnatural tolerance at low speed. She could hang in the air long past where a B-17 would have already collapsed. The German fighter overshot his rise. He miscalculated trajectory. He popped up too far forward. His guns cleared their deadly angle. He had missed the kill window. The rear gunner exhaled. The German now had to loop around, which meant time. Time in a crippled bomber is oxygen, prayer, and miles between life and a crash. The flight engineer murmured in disbelief. He expected a stall, and we gave him the wrong kind of stall. What saved them in that moment wasn't bravery. It wasn't luck. It was a British design gamble from 1939, wider wings. More lift per pound. Grace at the edge of doom. But there was still a second hunter coming. Bomber Command Intelligence had warned it. German night fighter teams worked in pairs. One flushed the cripple. The second killed it. The rear gunner spoke again. "Sirens!" Another contact. "Port side. Higher. He's lining us up from above." The first hunter failed. The second would not make the same mistake. This new attacker wasn't patient. He was diving fast from high altitude, aiming for a classic dorsal kill shot. And this time, a stall wouldn't save them. The pilot gritted his teeth. "Strap in. This one we have to outrun, even broken." The Lancaster could no longer outfight her enemy. But she had one last card. She could take punishment long enough to reach weather. And weather could hide what engines could no longer outrun. Ahead lay a body of cloud thick enough to eat radar. If they made it, if the wing held, if the engine didn't seize, if the airframe didn't buckle, the wounded giant was flying on 3 miracles already. She would need a 4th. The second German fighter dropped out of the cloud ceiling like a hawk, diving fast, guns already spitting streaks of white fire. Tracers slashed past the fuselage, ripping cloth and shattering a blister pane. The radio operator ducked, glass raining across his shoulders. The Lancaster had no clean evasive maneuvers left. She couldn't roll. She couldn't climb. She couldn't bank into the attacker's path. All she could do was endure. The pilot shoved the throttles forward, every working engine howling, forcing the dying aircraft toward the cloud bank ahead. The wounded wing groaned like timber under strain. The skin along the sparlin fluttered dangerously, like a sail about to tear free. The mid-upper gunner opened up with a burst, not to hit, but to force space. Tracers arced high, enough to warn the German. This prey still had claws. The German adjusted his angle, preparing a second dive. Closer, faster, lethal. The Lancaster reached the edge of the cloud. 5 seconds, the navigator said. "We don't have 5 seconds, the rear gunner muttered. 4, 3, 2. A burst of cannon fire slammed into the tail. Fabric peeled. A control cable snapped, with a sound like bone breaking. The pilot fought the column with one arm and rudder input alone, forcing the wreckage into the cloud bank just as the next burst screamed past where the cockpit had been. They vanished into white. The German overshot, blind. Inside the cloud, the world became fog, vibration, and prayer. Altimeter steady. Fuel dropping, controls sloppy, oxygen thin. They were no longer flying a bomber. They were keeping a dying animal alive long enough to collapse on friendly soil. The crew waited for fire, for structural break, for a stall that wouldn't recover. Instead, the Lancaster settled again, not gracefully, but faithfully. The flight engineer exhaled, "Sirs, she still wants to live, but clouds are only protection if you stay inside them." Once they broke through, the hunters would be waiting again. "You think we can reach the channel?" the navigator asked. The pilot didn't answer right away. He ran a hand along the throttle quadrant, feeling not controls. "But Burden, she'll break before she quits," he said quietly. "So we don't let her quit." There was a pause. Then the rear gunner said the words aloud for the first time. "We're not flying home. We're dragging her to safety." And they still had more than 200 miles to go. The cloud bank was not escape. It was a breathing space. And ahead, between them and England, waited fuel limits, structure fatigue, shock cooling from altitude change, and, worst of all, the North Sea. No bomber survives a ditching there. When the Lancaster emerged from the cloud's underbelly, the North Sea lay ahead, a dark, endless knife edge of water that killed more air crews than enemy guns ever did. A crash on land might mean a broken wing, a shattered fuselage, maybe a surviving crew. A crash into the North Sea meant a grave with no marker. The radio operator checked the emergency channel. Nothing but static. The trailing fuel line from the damaged wing misted again, flickering rainbow vapor into the slipstream. The engineer leaned forward. "Fuel gauge says we can make England." "But not a landing field," the navigator replied. 3 engines could reach Britain. 3 engines could not guarantee a runway. Their only chance was to keep height, keep glide margin, and pray the spar didn't fail before the coastline rose beneath them. The pilot pointed the wounded bomber toward the faintest hint of horizon glow. Not sunrise, but searchlights reflecting off cloud from the English coast. Home wasn't near. It was only possible. The second German fighter was still hunting them, not seen, but assumed. All crippled bombers were stalked until either radio contact was re-established or oil hit the sea. The rear gunner scanned again. Nothing, just blackness. Then he said something quiet, something no gunner normally admitted. "I think he's waiting, letting the sea finish. Us." That was a Luftwaffe tactic. Wounded. Bombers sometimes died without witnesses. Gravity became executioner. Fear, exhaustion became bullet. No tracer. Needed. The structural gamble inside the cockpit. The pilot made a decision. Not brave. Not reckless. Necessary. He trimmed the bomber slightly nose up, just a hair, to conserve altitude over speed. A normal bomber, hit this hard, would have bled lift and stalled. But the Lancaster wasn't normal. Her wing, more glider than brute, could float on physics that B-17 crews used to envy. The engineer checked the gauges and murmured like a doctor tending a critical patient. "If that spar cracks—" "It won't," the pilot cut in, but his eyes said it might. The navigator folded his chart. 70 to 80 more miles until we're in RAF radar net. 70 to 80. On 3 engines. With leaks, with structural damage, with a predator somewhere behind them. The crew went silent. The kind of silence only men living inside a gamble understand. The North Sea stretched below them. Cold, patient, waiting. And in that immense darkness, lit only by the wounded glow of 3 surviving engines, the pilot voiced the truth every Lancaster crew eventually learned. "If we make it home, it won't be because we flew her. It'll be because she refused to fall." They weren't surviving the flight now. They were surviving the distance. A difference measured not in miles, but in mercy. The horizon ahead thickened into a faint silver smear. The first suggestion of Britain. Not land yet, just possibility. The crew watched it, like starving men staring at bread still behind glass. Then the engineer spoke, voice tight. Port outer engine dropping oil pressure. We're losing another. 3 engines had carried them this far. 2 engines would not carry them home. The pilot ran numbers in his head faster than his instruments could confirm them. Not fear, calculation. They could not afford speed. They could not afford drag. They could not afford altitude loss. They could only afford belief in physics. The rear gunner was still scanning. Then, contact aft far. Same altitude. The German hadn't left. He had followed, patient as shadow, waiting for the dead stick moment, the exact point a bomber becomes a gliding coffin. He wanted a kill without firing, the Luftwaffe's proof of dominance. We took their power. The sea took their life. He was lining up for confirmation of the fall. He wouldn't strike. He would witness. The navigator's voice came, small but steady. Radar coverage in 30 miles. 30 miles might as well have been 30 galaxies. The pilot looked at the crippled panel. The Lancaster was now flying on. 1 good engine, 1 wounded engine, 1 failing engine, and 1 dead. No bomber should stay airborne on that. But this wasn't any bomber. This was a Lancaster, a machine built to endure damage first, perform second. The flight engineer leaned closer to the pilot. She won't hold power on 3 for 30 miles. I know, the pilot said. So we don't fly power. We fly lift, he trimmed again. Nose, still a hair high, forcing the airframe into a gliding equilibrium so precarious that any other bomber would have already stalled and cartwheeled into the sea. VTT, Lancaster floated. She refused to descend. She was too ruined to run, but too stubborn to fall. The German night fighter behind them blinked navigation lights once. A taunt, not a warning. Fall, you helpless giant. But home was no longer a hope. Home was a line of physics. And slowly, painfully, unbelievably, the coastline began to take shape beneath the haze. Not England yet, but England's shadow. They were going to reach radar, which meant warning stations, which meant fighter cover, which meant the hunter would be hunted. The German pilot realized it and banked away, not out of respect, out of mathematics. A dying Lancaster inside British radar nets had escorts. A dying Lancaster outside them had only gravity. They had crossed the invisible threshold. The rear gunner watched the German vanish back into cloud. He left. No one answered. Because only one truth mattered now. England was no longer ahead. It was beneath them, held aloft by wing, will, and a design no German guns understood. The first British radar ping hit them like a silent blessing. A controller's voice crackled through a static clogged frequency. Unidentified, heavy, altitude unstable, squawking damaged. Do you require emergency field? The pilot pressed the transmit switch, voice barely above breath. Affirmative! 3 engines out or failing. Structure compromised. Requesting nearest strip. The reply came instantly. Divert to Manston. Longfield? Emergency crews ready. Manston. The graveyard that doubled as a lifeboat. A runway built for bombers on their last heartbeat. The engineer checked his panel. Port outer won't last the descent. I don't need it for descent, the pilot said softly. I just need her to stay in the air until we begin one. The Lancaster, riddled, buckling, held together by stubbornness and steel bones, crossed the Kent coast like a dying war horse returning to its stable. Villages below slept unaware that a flying ruin, once meant to burn over the Ruhr, was now limping above their rooftops. When the runway lights of Manston finally appeared through mist, the crew didn't cheer. They exhaled. The pilot lined up final approach. Flaps, partial, because full might shear the wing. Throttle, feathered, coaxing not power, but grace. Altitude, falling, unwilling, but falling. The Lancaster came in too hot, then sagged like a body collapsing into arms. She hit hard, gears screaming, one wheel giving way, wings scraping tarmac in a shower of sparks. But she did not break. She slid, shuddered, slowed, stopped. Silence. Not triumph. Just survival. The ground crew ran forward, jaws slack as they saw daylight through her wings. What should have been wreckage was still recognizably aircraft. The flight engineer stepped down first, touching the tarmac like a man testing if he was alive. The rear gunner climbed out and looked back at the riddled fuselage. "She shouldn't have flown," he said quietly. The pilot touched the battered skin of the wing. "She didn't fly. She carried us." Why a shot-up Lancaster could still fly home? Because it wasn't designed like a bomber at all. It was designed like a paradox. Fuel in the fuselage, not the wings. No fireball on impact. Enormous glider-like lift from a cathedral-sized wing. Oversprung spars built to bend before breaking. Enough structural forgiveness to absorb punishment until mercy arrived. The Germans shot at an aircraft. They did not understand they were shooting at a bridge. And on that night over the Ruhr, a burning, half-ruined cathedral of wood, steel, and lift brought 7 men home across miles she had no right to survive. Not because she was lucky, but because she was Lancaster.